What is of greatest value to us? What is it that takes priority in our lives over everything else? And that is exactly what Haggai was saying to these people. He said, consider your ways. I want you to think. Think about what's going on. Look at what is happening around you. Put two and two together and come to the proper conclusion based upon the proper thought process, because you have placed in your thought process the proper content to what it is that you need to be thinking about. And so with that in mind, we now turn to Haggai and to the message that he sought to this recently returned Jewish group of exiles, as it centers around basically motivating them to get their thinking straight, which would then lead them to get their priorities straight, resulting then in the very important task of rebuilding the temple of God. Okay, so the first message is in the first chapter, and it's the first 15 verses. I'm going to assume that everybody's read the text. I mean, Haggai is a very short book. You can read it in less than 5 minutes. It'll take you perhaps a lifetime to understand it, but you can read it in about 5 minutes. So it's not really a very a long book to read. And quite frankly, I think that there are some challenging parts in it, but for the most part, I think it's a relatively simple book to get the message out of. So question 2, it's question 2, 3, and 4. That's one of the ways I figured out when you want to have one question, or when you produce a question sheet, and I've tried to limit my questions to 5, but it's like I have really 10 questions. So what I do is in one question put 3 questions, and it kind of makes it look like it's a 5-question sheet, but it's really an 8-question sheet. Or in this case, it's actually a 10-question sheet because of some of the other questions I have. But anyway, that's just the way I do it. Okay, so we're going to explore this, each one of these independently, but I do believe that initially we can answer the questions all at one time. And so the first part of question 2 is, what is the problem that Haggai identified in the first message? And I gave you the verses for that. And then I asked you to compare that with Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 through 5 and verse 24. And then I asked you to compare that and ask you, why do you think this problem developed? And then the third one, which is the application part of this, is there ever a time that it is just right to serve the Lord? Okay, so let's look at the first part first. What is the problem Haggai is identifying in his first message? Right, he's telling them, get busy rebuilding the temple. And there is an interesting reason as to why he is doing this, because well, first of all, let me point out that the message is actually directed to Zerubbabel and Joshua. These were the ones who were the leaders out of there. And of course, Dan, in his studies in the book of Ezra, has spent a great deal of time with this and spend more time with it. But the message is directed to Zerubbabel and Joshua. They were the leaders who brought the first wave of exiles back from Babylonian captivity. But the intent is that the message that Haggai is giving to them I'm sorry? It's not time to build the Lord's house. It's just not time. The time is not yet right to build the Lord's house. Now, there is where I asked you to review Ezra chapter 4 in verses 1 through 5 and then verse 24. And Dan did, I think, a really good job Sunday pointing out that when you get into that chapter, there's some chronological difficulty with that. That's the reason I had the first 5 verses and then verse 24. Because they go together. We're not going to get into, I don't think I need to get into it, because Dan did I think he did job of being able to help us to see that. But in looking at these verses, why do you think they came to the conclusion that it is not yet time to build the Lord's house? Okay. Okay. So it centers primarily around politics. That's the way I would put it. Now, obviously, it's more than that. But it is very political that when you look at what was happening here, because the political situation of the day was very tenuous for them. As we have studied in our lessons on the book of Ezra, when they came back, they started out like gangbusters, didn't they? I mean, they were just excited, and they laid the temple foundation and everything, but then they started getting resistance. And when the resistance came, that's when they started getting a little bit discouraged. And the discouragement led to further discouragement, to the point that what they did is they just stopped it altogether. And it stopped for 16 to 20 years, depending upon what scholar you may be reading after as far as the timeline is concerned. But at least 16 years, they had brought this building of the temple to a complete stop. But that didn't mean they weren't busy. They were busy, as he says in verse 4, building their own homes. And in building their own homes, it appears there was very little resistance that was coming from their enemies. But when it came to doing the work of building the temple of the Lord, the resistance led them to conclude that this was not a good time, and they needed to wait for a more favorable climate, a more favorable political climate, in order to be able to go about doing what it is that they had come back to Israel to do, and that is to rebuild this temple. So that brings me to that third part of the question number 2. Is there ever a time that is just right to serve the Lord?
Now.
I'm sorry?
Now.
Well, now is the time. That's right. That's correct. But there are a lot of people that aren't doing that. Why is that? Okay, all right. I think that's a good way of explaining it, Aaron. Well, I think that helped in their discouragement, but that's not what stopped the building, because they would have gone on. They do go on eventually with the building, and they still experience that, as we will see. But it centers more around this idea. It reminds me, I guess what I'm trying to say is, it reminds me of the occasion. Remember when Paul and Felix were having their discussion of Acts chapter 24, and Felix came down and listened to him talk about God and Jesus and righteousness and judgment and all this kind of stuff. And remember what Felix said? He said, when I have a more convenient time, I'll call. Okay. Is being a Christian, is being a child of God convenient? No, there is nothing convenient about it. And so the point is that we should never expect cooperation from the enemies of God in doing His will. Yeah? Right, and that goes to the very point I was making right at the start. What do we think about? Because if we think about the fact that I am, just not worthy of all of this, well, guess what? You're not. Nobody is worthy of any of this. Like what God is telling them is I want you to get busy. I want you to get busy doing the task that I've given you to do, and that is to rebuild the temple. So it is evident, though, and with all due respect to Aaron and Jordan's comments, because I do think that there is some validity to that, but the most obvious thing that Haggai is addressing is the fact that these were people who put their own comfort before they put any kind of effort into the work of God, and is rebuilding the temple, which goes to, I think, what Cynthia was saying about priorities. Their priorities were all messed up. And so with this before them, just a second, with this before them, he tells them twice to think about their lives.
I think it's even more simple than that. They did not trust God to help them get in the heart.
Right.
They didn't trust God to take care of them. They felt like they had to take care of themselves before they could take care of him.
Right.
If they had done what he needed done, he would take care of the rest. But they didn't want to do that. They didn't have enough trust and faith in him.
Exactly.
To do what he said he would do, so they could do what they did.
And that's a great point, I think, that you're making there, Christy, because really that's what it all boils down to, is the faith and the trust that we have in God. And obviously, these were people who failed in that. They didn't think that God was coming through. And we will look at some of the reasons as to why they had come to that particular kind of conclusion. But again, he tells them twice in this first message, he says, I want you to think about your ways. Okay, so what he was telling them then is the fact that you've been focusing upon your work in building your homes. You've been working hard to take care of your physical needs. You've been totally neglecting the work of God. And the result, as far as God was concerned, what was God's action, his providential action in all of this? Well, he was displeased, but how did he manifest that displeasure? I'm sorry? He didn't bless them. That's exactly right. In fact, not only did he not bless them, he worked against them. And so what you see in all of this is the fact that God's providential order was working in their everyday lives so that they found absolutely no satisfaction with all of the effort they put forth into seeing to their own needs. Which is what he says in verses 9 through 11. You looked for much, behold, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why? Declares the Lord of hosts, because of my house that lies in ruins, while each of you busies himself in his own house. Therefore the heavens above you have withheld the dew, and the earth has withheld its produce. And I've called for a drought on the land, and on the hills, and on the grain, and the new wine, the oil, and on what the ground brings forth, on man and beast, and on all their labors. In other words, they could not connect this terrible crop production with the fact that they weren't doing what God wanted them to do. They had it was a total disconnect. And what Haggai is getting them to see is the reason why you are experiencing this is because you're not doing what God wants you to do. Therefore, God is not blessing you. Okay, so the situation has been assessed. It has been put before them. And what is the response of the people? Here is where they're different than their forefathers. They feared him. They did what he said to do. And so with Zerubbabel and with Joshua at the lead, all the returned exiles took this message to their hearts, and unlike generations before them, as Joanne said, they feared the Lord. They respected him, they reverenced him, and they did what he said. They repented of their indifference to the will of God, they readjusted their priorities, and they got back to the task of rebuilding the temple. And once this message got through to these people and they readjusted their priorities and got back to the rebuilding of the temple, then they received the encouraging message that is found in verse 13 when he says, the messenger of the Lord spoke to the people and he said, I am with you, declares the Lord. And in verse 14, and the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people. In other words, what you see happening here is the fact that they had been people who had been neglecting the will of God, now they're getting back to it. They've readjusted their priorities, and consequently, they received this message that God was with them, strengthening and endorsing their resolve, and also giving them what they needed in order to be able to do it. Okay. So that's the first message. And thanks be to God it worked. Okay, but now we come to the second message. And that is found in the first 9 verses of the second chapter. And I don't really have any questions about that. It's hard for me to be able to figure out how to ask those questions, so I just skip it. But, well, actually, I do have question number 3. We'll get to that in a minute. But what this second message is all about is the promised glory of the new temple. Okay, and this goes to what Aaron particularly, I think, was talking about. This message is spoken about a month later. The first one was at the end of the month of August. This one is in the early part of October, at least as far as our dating is concerned. And they had renewed their effort in rebuilding the temple. Things had begun. Progress had been made. And I think it's also interesting to me, and I didn't really know this until I was doing a little bit more research on this, that the date that is spoken of is, I think, highly significant, because it says in the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Now, did anybody explore that date? Okay, let me tell you what it is. It is during the month, or during the feast of what is called the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, which was to occur on the 7th month. And it was to start on the 15th day of the month. And this is all recorded in Leviticus chapter 23. What was the Feast of Tabernacles? What was it supposed to be like? You remember? It's to be a time of great joy. They're celebrating because it's the bringing in of the crop. It is also taking care of or remembering the travels through the wilderness. That's the reason why the tabernacles were set up. These tents that they would stay out in during this period of time. So we're on the next to the last day of this particular feast, which was to be a joyous occasion. But the problem is this group apparently was anything but joyous. Because first of all, think about the harvest. What would it have been like? It would have been terrible, because God had providentially been preventing them from being able to have a good harvest. Secondly, what would have been the other thing that would cause the problem? That would cause them not to be filled with joy. And it's spoken of directly. It goes back to what Aaron was saying. The temple they were rebuilding seemed to be almost as nothing in comparison to the one that Solomon had built, which had been destroyed by Babylon. And it caused the people to become discouraged. And that's what you see in verses 2 and 3. And particularly verse 3, who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it as nothing in your eyes? And so, well, it seems to me that it's evident that some of these returned exiles remembered, they lived before the period of the exile, and they remembered the Temple of Solomon and what it looked like. So they would have been quite old. And so consequently, the inferiority of this new temple that is being built, coupled with all of the other discouraging circumstances, resulted in many of these people becoming totally disheartened. And it really goes to the passage in Ezra chapter 3, which deals with the laying of the foundation, when there was joy that was being manifested by the people, and there was great weeping that was being manifested. So there was a mixture here. And the ones who were crying about all of this were the people who remembered what Solomon's temple looked like. And this temple is nothing compared to Solomon's temple. In fact, I don't believe any of the temples of Israel would have been comparable to it. Even the second temple, what is known as Second Temple Judaism, during the period of time in which Jesus lived, which would have been a magnificent structure that had been redone by Herod. It wouldn't have compared with Solomon's temple. And so the people are discouraged. And so having brought this problem of discouragement then into focus, what Haggai does is he delivers a message of encouragement and hope. And he tells them 4 things. That's what question 3 is all about. 4 admonitions he gives to this discouraged people that will provide them with encouragement and hope. Did you see what they were that's found in verses 4 and 5? 4 things he said to them. Number 1, be strong. Number 2, to work. Okay, that's right. And so he says, remember I am still with you. And then the 4th one is fear not. Okay, God had made a covenant with Israel. when they came out of Egypt. And God remained faithful to his covenant, even if Israel did not remain faithful. And so just as God had been with them through all of their ups and downs, he was still with them. And he was now going to see them through all of these hard times that they were experiencing. And so it seems to me that just as these words of encouragement were given to a very discouraged people, and this would help them then to overcome their discouragement, I think that these four things are critical even in our lives. That when we get discouraged, we need to understand that we need to be strong. We need to work. We need to understand that God is still with us and we need to fear none. And I'm telling you, in the world in which we live today, with the insanity that is going on around us, I cannot think of four better admonitions than those four right there. Because it doesn't mean we have to be discouraged. We can be encouraged and continue to go on. And then what he does is he proceeds with even stronger words of encouragement, looking to the future when the temple would be even more glorious than Solomon's temple, as he mentions that in verses 6 through 9. Now, what do you think he's talking about there? Because it's not Herod's temple. It's messianic. It has messianic implications. So what Haggai is doing is encouraging the people to wait just a little bit longer to the time when the Lord would shake all of creation. Do you remember where that verse is found? It's the only verse, by the way, that's found, that's cited in the New Testament. Remember where it is? It's in Hebrews chapter 12, talking about this kingdom that God is establishing. And so the Hebrew writer cites the book of Haggai, and he talks about the shaking of the creation. But what is also interesting is that in Haggai's description of all of this, it's talking about causing every nation to part with their treasures, adding glory to the temple, resulting in it being even grander than Solomon's temple. And what that suggests is that the Gentiles, the nations, would also have a part to play in the achievement of God's ultimate purpose with respect to the temple. Now, obviously, that's not talking about this day that Haggai is writing about. And it wasn't talking about even within the near future. It's talking about the distant future, looking to the arrival of the Lord of the temple and the fact that he would replace it and he would surpass it with respect to the blessings that he would bring, not just to Israel, but to all nations, which is what the Hebrew writer is talking about over in Hebrews chapter 12. And so we have the advantage of hindsight. We now can look through the lens of Jesus. And what we see is that this is pointing to Jesus as this second temple. And I think that there's a couple of ways we could look at it. The fact that here is the Son of God who actually honored the temple by his presence when he went into it. But if you look at the text in John chapter 2, we're not going to take the time to read it, but that is where Jesus goes into the temple, as there's initial cleansing of the temple. And so he is honoring the temple's presence by his presence. But more so in that text, Jesus goes on to say, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And what was he talking about? He was talking about himself. And so Jesus is now the temple of God. And that is a great, significant concept. When you think about it, he is God with us. No longer in a physical temple, but in the body of Jesus Christ. And so all, whether Jew or Gentile, who come to God through Jesus, what do they now constitute according to what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 3? If you remember that text. They constitute the temple. We are being built up as a holy temple unto the Lord. And so it is in this temple, in and through Jesus, that true peace is given. Because that's what he says, there will be peace. And it is received by those who will come to God through Christ, therefore anticipating the new creation where there is no temple, because the whole creation, the whole new creation is a temple. It is the dwelling place of God for men. And that's, I think, made clear over Revelation chapter 21. So, basically, to a discouraged group of people, Haggai is offering these words of God to provide them with encouragement and hope. To be strong, to work, to know that God is still with them, not to fear, motivating them to continue on their work to build the temple. Okay, we've only got about 7 minutes left, so the rest of this is basically going to be me talking. Because I do want to try to complete this as quickly as we can so I don't have to carry it over into the lesson for next week, since although it's similar, Zechariah is vastly different as well. Okay, so in Haggai chapter 2, verses 10 through 19 is now the third message. And the fourth message is also delivered on the same time. And what he's doing here is he's comparing life before rebuilding the temple with life after rebuilding the temple. And so it's now 2 months later. By this time, the winter crops have already been sown. They have been watered by the autumn rains, with all of the accompanying hope of a good year, free from drought, free from pests that would only hurt the crop. But there was uncertainty among the people because their past experience has been, we have not had good crops. Okay, so it was at this time that Haggai then speaks about this concept of ritualistic holiness and defilement, essentially making the point that holiness cannot be passed on to that which is defiled, but defilement can be passed on to that which is holy. And he makes that point in verses 10 through 12. And his point was that the holy spiritual endeavors that these Jews participated in had become defiled. And it wasn't because of the incorrectness of their sacrifices. Ezra 3 points that out. They were offering sacrifices upon the altar, and they were offering the correct sacrifices. But it is because these were defiled because there was a dead body in the midst of them. And what is the dead body? It's the temple. The temple has not been rebuilt. And so it is like in their midst is this unfinished temple where these sacrifices will be offered. And so this dead body is defiling all of their sacrifices. And so he brings this to their attention. And he tells them to think about it, to consider their past experience while looking forward to the new thing that God was now going to be doing in their midst. So as long as the temple lay unfinished, this defiled everything. It resulted in agricultural and in economic suffering. But that would change. And it would change by God's grace and mercy, which is what he goes on to say then in verses 18 and 19, where it's talking about life after rebuilding the temple. Finally, having gotten their priorities straightened out, demonstrating their repentance, getting busy rebuilding the temple, God promised once again to bless these people. So they planted their seeds. But prior to the rebuilding of the temple, the crops virtually failed. Now things are going to be different. And so as he says there in this 19th verse of the second chapter, is the seed yet in the barn? And the answer is no, it's been planted. Indeed, the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, and the olive tree have yielded nothing. But from this day on, I will bless you. And so what he's doing is telling them, this is what it's going to be like once you get busy and you start rebuilding the temple. And it wasn't because God was obligated to bless them. This was by his grace that he is doing this for these people. So they didn't have to be uncertain about their crop production. God was going to take care of them. God would bless them because of their faithfulness. I'm telling you, if you can't get a lesson out of that, I don't know what lesson you could ever get. It's just simply faithfulness always brings God blessing. Okay, now the fourth message, the final one, is a little bit more enigmatic. It is Zerubbabel as God's signet ring. So we're going to go through this rather quickly because we only got about 4 minutes left here to stop to ring the first bell. This message is addressed to one individual, and that is to Zerubbabel. Now, what is unique about Zerubbabel? What makes him so critical in this? I told you I wasn't going to ask him questions, but I didn't ask him that. What makes him unique? That's right. That's right. He is in the Davidic lineage. Okay, now that is something that is important. So what is happening now is that Haggai is prophesying a new phase in world history that is about to come. So after considering the past and present conditions of Israel, Haggai has this final message that looks to the future, in which the promise that God had made to David about a permanent dynasty, which is recorded over 2 Samuel chapter 7, is now restored, once again providing encouragement to these Jews. Because you remember when they went into Babylonian captivity, there was one king that was left, a guy by the name of Jehoiachin, and he is in captivity. And so what you see in all of this is the fact that it looks as if this everlasting kingdom that God had promised David has come to an end. And in fact, what's interesting, the passage that I gave you in Jeremiah chapter 22, Jeremiah prophesied that Jehoiachin had been rejected. And so now it looks as if, and by the way, he uses the phrase signet ring there. And what he does, what it appears, is that the promise to David has failed. But in Zerubbabel, who was the grandson of Jehoiachin, the promise is being renewed. And the promise of David's permanent kingdom is restored. He is God's signet ring. A signet ring was a token of authority. You know, they wore a ring, they stamped things. That is the symbol of authority. And so he is God's token of authority that what had been taken away had been restored. And what is also interesting is he speaks here of the impending destruction of the Gentile nations establishing God's permanent rule. And I'll tell you that there's people all over the board with what that means. Some think it has some kind of an eschatological meaning to it with respect to the end times, that is the end of the world. Others think that it has reference to what was going on during that period of time. If you're interested in what I think, I really haven't come to a conclusion on this, but to me, that just kind of helps. It causes us to miss the point because it's all tied directly to Zerubbabel. And what is happening here is God is promising to him and to Israel that the Davidic line has been restored, that his kingdom will be established, and there is no kingdom of man who will be able to stop this from happening. No Gentile nation will be able to stop it. And so the messianic implications in all of this is the fact that Zerubbabel is now ruling as a governor, apparently appointed by Cyrus, but he was never a king. In fact, Israel never became a kingdom independent again. They never had a king after this. And so the point of Haggai's prophecy then is not to say to Zerubbabel that you will be a king, but it is to say to Israel that this promise that God made to David has been renewed, that it had been taken away in Jehoiachin, it is now being renewed in Zerubbabel. So the continued link of the Davidic line is going to happen. And it then finds its fulfillment in Jesus, establishing God's permanent rule, God's promise to David. And all you have to do is look at Matthew's, in fact, both Matthew and Luke, but particularly Matthew's account, and you see that Zerubbabel is in the lineage of Jesus. So, he is the one who now becomes God's sign of authority that the kingdom is going to happen. And it's going to happen in the future Messiah who will come. So, as one man put it, Zerubbabel represents the resumption of the messianic line interrupted by the exile. So, we're done, and I'll just make this observation real quick. The book of Haggai starts out very depressing and very disappointing. But I'm telling you what, it ends on one of the highest notes that you could possibly know. The establishing of the kingdom of God. It is going to happen. And in Christ, it did happen. And so, praise God for that, for what he has done, for his Son. It makes it possible for all, Jews and Gentiles, to be a part of this eternal kingdom, looking forward to the time when we will be with him in eternity. Okay, that's it for tonight. Next week, we're going to start our study in the book of Zechariah. We're going to introduce it, and then later on we'll get into the text. A couple of weeks we'll start the text, which is going to be rather dicey, because that is a complicated book, just by the very nature. But I'm right. I'll tell you that. My understanding of it.